So we are looking at chapter 5 of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And before we jump into chapter 5, I just wanted to go back very quickly to chapter 4 to just make one other point. I had mentioned when we were discussing this in the chapter 4 video, which if you have not seen, I'll link up above that chapter 4 video. I'll also link up above the chapter 3 video. But I mentioned in our chapter 4 video that we start to see the biblical parallels between Victor and the creature, the monster. We start to see that coming to resemble more and more God's relationship with Adam in the Old Testament. And I think probably the most obvious biblical parallel in chapter 4 is when Victor says the following. He's telling us, it's on page 48 in my version. He mentions, Victor does, he says the following. And I want you to listen to the language here. He says, "As I dabbled among the unhallowed damps of the grave," so he'd be going around to different graveyards for body parts. So as I dabbled among the unhallowed damps of the grave, or tortured the living animal to animate the lifeless clay. So he's talking about what he's doing to be able to bring life to this monster. And he describes the monster as lifeless clay, which obviously the monster is not lifeless clay. He tells us earlier on in the chapter that he's using human parts and he's making the monster, 8 feet in height. So it's obviously not clay, but what this is a reference to, I could only think of one thing this would be a reference to, and this is when God is creating Adam in the Garden of Eden. Remember, he creates Adam from the dirt and the dust of the ground. Another way of interpreting the dirt or the dust of the ground is clay. That's another way of interpreting the Hebrew word. And so similarly here, I think Mary Shelley is trying to get us to think about Victor as a kind of God figure here. I mean, you could say he's playing God, and I don't think it would be a stretch because Mary Shelley's wanting us to make that connection. She's later on going to make that even more explicit when she has the monster talking to Victor and referring to himself as Adam, right? So I mean, it's not a stretch to read into that. So chapter 5. So if chapter 4 was about Victor tinkering in his laboratory, working tirelessly to try to come up with this monster, making himself sick in the process, chapter 5 is when the monster finally comes to life. He tells us in chapter 5 that it's after 2 years of work on this. So by the end of creating this monster, and the monster we're going to see running away, 6 years will have passed with him at school, but just spending 2 years in the creation of this monster. And when it finally comes to life, as I said, after 2 years, it is, we're told in chapter 5, a dreary night in November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils, Victor says. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. So, typical horror fashion, right? It's a cold, dreary night in November, and this is when the creature's finally coming to life. And so in this chapter, I think what we're also going to see is more examples of Victor as an unreliable narrator. Remember, Victor's sections of this, or really all the sections of this novel, are told in the first-person point of view. Some of those first-person chapters are Victor, which these are the chapters we're looking at now. Some of the earlier ones, which I didn't have you read, are from Robert Walton, the explorer's point of view. And then some of those first-person chapters are going to be from the monster's point of view. But here Victor is talking in the first person. He's recounting this whole story to Robert Walton, and I think we're going to see some unreliability from him here. Just here's an example, I think, where you'll see some unreliability from him, or just some conflicting emotion from him. I mean, just look at the way he describes in these next couple of sentences. Look at the conflicting way he describes this monster when it finally comes to life. He says the following: He says, "How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, the monster coming to life? Or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful." Beautiful! Exclamation point. Great God. So he's using that word beautiful there, right? So beautiful. His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath, his hair of lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of pearly whiteness. All of these seem like very positive descriptions of the monster. And yet, in those same couple of sentences, he's a wretch. This is a catastrophe, right? So Victor is very conflicted here. My edition of the book, the Barnes and Noble Classics edition, um, even gives a little footnote here, maybe to explain some of this unreliability from Victor, and it basically points out that there are some cases where women who are giving birth to their children will have this very conflicted feeling, which is, on the one hand, this is beautiful because it's life coming from me, and yet also it's surprising and shocking and horrible because it's maybe more shriveled and stranger looking than they had initially thought. So there's this very conflicted feeling, and that might be what Victor is feeling here when he sees his creation finally coming to life after 2 years. Um, he goes on, but these luxuriances, the hair and the eyes, etc., only formed a more horrid contrast with the watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set. So very conflicted in this description, and the description only goes on here. I mean, he later on calls the face of the monster a horror. Calls it the bringing the demonical corpse to life. I mean, so it's, you see this very conflicted feeling. And so how does Victor react when this monster finally comes to life? He is horrified. He's not happy about his creation. If you remember, in the previous chapters, he was excited about the monster praising him. Now he is terrified. He can't sleep. He's pacing back and forth in the night. He finally, just leaves the house and runs off. He doesn't want to be near the thing. And while he's out and about, we get a little in chapter 5. There's a little insert of a poem there. It's the poem, "The Rime of the Ancient Mariner" by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, a poet who really influenced Mary Shelley, who's another romantic poet like Mary Shelley's husband. And Victor is thinking of this poem as he's wandering the streets, trying to get away from the monster. He has this, the lines are flashing through his mind. These are the lines from the poem. "Like one who on a lonely road doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned around walks on, and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread." So in the story of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, I'm not going to go into it too much, but just there's a mariner who, through his own bad decisions on this boat, he lots of his crew are dying, and he is regretting and feeling guilt over this decision he's made to, he shoots an albatross, a bird, and it's kind of leads to the downfall of the whole crew on the boat, including himself. And so similarly, Victor is thinking this as he's wandering the streets of Ingolstadt. He's thinking about, not wanting to turn around because there is a frightful fiend that might be close behind him, the monster, right? He's afraid this thing is gonna be following him. And while he's out wandering the streets of Ingolstadt, he runs into his friend Henry Clerval. Henry is visiting him at school. I don't think there's any indication that Victor knew that Henry was coming, but he's thrilled to see Henry. On the one hand, let me rephrase that. He's conflicted. He's thrilled on the one hand that Henry's here. He's someone he knows, he's someone he's familiar with. And yet he's also very scared that the monster's gonna appear. When Victor runs into Henry in the street, Victor says to him, "It gives me the greatest delight to see you, but tell me how you left my father, brothers, and Elizabeth." So there, Victor is referencing his father, his two younger brothers, and then Elizabeth, who his half stepsister, um, and well, not really even a stepsister, really more of like adopted sister, uh, and so yeah, he's basically asking Henry here, like, what are they, what, how are they? I haven't talked to them in so long, and Henry tells him, very well and very happy, only a little uneasy that they hear from you so seldom. You haven't written to them in so long. And he basically says, like, you should write a letter to them. And given that it's Henry's first time visiting Victor at school, Victor does what any college student does, which is, hey, do you want to see, you want to see my dorm? I'll give you a tour of campus. Uh, but like I said, he's also very, very worried of the possibility that Henry will run into the monster. And so here is that scene, a great scene actually, of Victor bringing Henry back to his dorm. And as we're going through this scene of Victor bringing Henry back to the dorm, I want you to I want you to pay attention to what Victor's concern is, and how small and how local Victor's concerns are. That he's not thinking about the big picture when it comes to this monster. He's thinking very much small and selfish. So pay attention to this. Victor says, I trembled excessively. I could not endure to think of, and far less to allude to, the occurrences of the previous night. I wasn't going to tell him about what I did the previous night in making this monster come to life. I walked with a quick pace, and we soon arrived at my college. I then reflected, and the thought made me shiver that the creature whom I had left in my apartment might still be there, alive and walking about. I dreaded to behold this monster, but I feared still more that Henry should see him. Entreating him, Henry, therefore, to remain a few minutes at the bottom of the steps, I darted up toward my room. He's going to go and check and see and make sure the coast is clear. My hand was already on the lock before I recollected myself. I then paused, and a cold shivering came over me. I threw the door forcibly open, as children are accustomed to do when they expect a specter, a ghost, to stand in waiting for them on the other side, but nothing appeared. I stepped fearfully in. The apartment was empty, and my bedroom was also freed from its hideous guest. Hideous guest. I could hardly believe that so great a good fortune could have befallen me, but when I became assured that my enemy had indeed fled, I clapped my hands for joy and ran down to Clerval. Henry. So I want you to just, so what did we just observe there? What we just observed there is Victor goes back to his apartment. He's really, really worried that the monster is going to confront or is going to run into his good friend, and then he's going to have to explain himself. It turns out the monster's not there. And his reaction is not, oh my goodness, this thing that I created that is 8 feet tall and stronger than me is on the loose. That's not his thought. That doesn't even occur to him. Rather, his thought is, oh, what a relief. Henry's not going to have to see this thing. That's what I mean by he's thinking very small. He's thinking very local. He's thinking really about himself here. That I'm not going to have to explain myself. I'm not going to have to explain this to Henry. I'm not embarrassed. I'm not going to be embarrassed. But really, there's a monster on the loose, right? And he doesn't seem concerned about it at all. In fact, he says he clapped his hands for joy and ran down to get Henry. So Victor's really not thinking about the wider implications of what's going on with this monster. And I would argue that he doesn't really start to think about the wider implications of the monster, what or the consequences of his technology, he doesn't really think about that until the monster starts killing people. Spoiler alert, the monster's going to start killing people. So he doesn't really start to consider that until the monster actually starts killing people. And kind of at that point, it's too late. And so they, Henry comes in, and Victor is he's just overly excited. He's super excited about like the fact that the monster's not there. Henry's a little worried about like how excited he is. At first Henry thinks he's excited to see him, and that's why he's clapping and jumping around. But then it becomes clear that something's up with Victor here. And then Victor has what, I think Mary Shelley refers to it as, he then has, this today, the day that Henry comes over, is the beginning of what Mary Shelley calls the commencement of a nervous fever. I don't know if Victor is having what we might call a nervous breakdown here, that he's sort of excited but also irritable, and like doesn't know how to deal with the emotions here. And he's shut up with this nervous fever for, we're told, several months. And Henry's a good friend and takes care of him. But this whole time the monster is, Victor has no idea where this monster is. And we kind of we end the chapter on with Victor promising to write Elizabeth. His cousin is the term that's used here, but really she's an adopted sister. And so we end on that note. We end chapter 5 on that note. Now we're gonna skip chapter 6. The next video, which I'll link above, is going to be the video for chapter 7. And in the chapter 7 video, I'll just give us a little bit of background on what happens in chapter 6, but we're really going to focus mostly on chapter 7.